Hello, this is Jason York from District Administration, and I want to welcome everyone to today's web seminar, Emerging Issues in School Threat Assessment, brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor, Navigate 360. Before we get underway, please review these quick housekeeping items on your screen, including the answer to our most frequently asked question. Yes, everyone who registered and attended will receive a link to the slides and the recording from today's webinar. And now to lead us off and moderate the webinar is John Paul Guilbeau, CEO of Navigate 360. Take it away, JP.
Good afternoon or good morning to everyone wherever you may be in the nation. My name is JP Guilbeau. I'm Chief Executive Officer of Navigate 360. And it's my honor to sponsor this webinar and promote the important work of Dr. Dewey Cornell and his commitment to preventing school violence and enhancing educational outcomes. A bit about Navigate 360 and our work. We know that there are many signs that come to light after a tragedy has occurred. And as a company, we're working with Dr. Cornell, who I'll introduce in a moment, to strive and provide schools with a science-based approach that allows them to leverage the data and analyze information holistically so they can respond to threats. It's with that goal and focus in mind that we share this information today and the CSTAG approach to really reduce suspensions, improve student outcomes, and overall well-being at school. So with that, let me just introduce Dr. Cornell. Dr. Cornell is a forensic and clinical psychologist and professor of education at the University of Virginia, and he's known nationally as the leading expert on youth violence and school security across the country. Dr. Cornell has spent decades researching violence prevention strategies and interventions to help schools reduce behavioral problems and incidents. And he's developed a comprehensive school threat assessment guideline, or what is known as the CSTAG model, based on his years of research in the field. It was first established in 2002 and refined in 2018, and takes a problem-solving approach to violence prevention with an emphasis on harm reduction. Earlier this year, as I mentioned, Dr. Cornell and Navigate began a partnership to incorporate this model into software and integrated data that would facilitate collaboration, the streamlining of process, and the connection of team members with the information to implement the harm reduction plans for at-risk students. So with that, let me say thank you to Dr. Cornell for sharing his expertise and experience, and for you, all of you joining today, we greatly appreciate your time. Dr. Cornell, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, JP. I appreciate that. I'm happy to be here. Thank all of you for taking your time to listen in. We'll have copies of the slides. We will answer your questions either at the end of this broadcast or maybe with a document that we'll send back afterwards. So if you have specific questions, feel free to write them into the chat box. I'm going to turn off my camera here and focus on my presentation. And we have a lot to cover today. The three topics here are listed, but I've got about 50 slides, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. And again, I'll try to answer your questions at the end. Now, first, I want to talk about the pandemic crisis, which certainly has created a lot of challenges for us in education. But before I talk about the challenges, I really want to emphasize that our youth are resilient, and most of our kids are going to do okay. And when they come back to school, they're going to be very happy to see their friends, the happiest to be back at school probably ever, just because of the change after the long break. And I think they're going to be responsive to the tone we set as educators. That is, when their teachers and when staff members are positive, upbeat, structured, supportive, students will respond to that. But if we're not, if we don't set a positive, structured, and supportive tone, I think we could create more difficulty and problems. Let me just say that our kids will be coming with a variety of different experiences over this long break. We're going to see a lot of stress from home. Certainly a number of students will have lost family members. I know in the class that I taught at the University of Virginia this last semester, I had 26 students in the class, and 3 of them lost a family member during the semester. That's extraordinarily high, and I know we will have other kids who are bereaved. We also have, of course, many kids from low-income homes, and that's only been exacerbated over the past few months. We have kids with hunger insecurity. We have a lot of domestic conflict that may have erupted in our home or continued in the homes, and so kids that will be experiencing that. And of course, child abuse is a prevalent problem and ongoing concern. And so with all of these sources of stress, I think our school counselors and psychologists and social workers are going to have plenty to do. Now, this is especially relevant to threat assessment because when students make a threat, particularly more serious threats, we want to assess the stress level, the factors in the student's background and life circumstances. And we often find trauma histories, stress histories in these young people's background that help us understand why this threat emerged. Now, if that wasn't enough, we also have to think about the stresses that will be created in school, in the school environment. And certainly, there's going to be some new rules at school, new norms for conduct and behavior having to do with health and safety. And we don't have the kind of norms for those because they're new. We're going to have to work out how we handle students who violate rules. We're going to have to recognize that students may be coming from families where there's a lot of variation and whether they paid attention to the government's health guidelines. And so there's going to be a disciplinary challenge as well as an educational challenge. We're also seeing reports of teasing related to health issues, some Asian youth being teased about the origin of the virus. We see kids using spitting and threats of contamination to tease one another. And we're seeing a lot that's sort of compounded by the social media. So all of these are going to be challenges, and they may be occasions in which students make threatening statements or engage in threatening behavior that we're going to need to assess. Now, this is not even to talk about the academic challenges and the academic stress, but polls show that youngsters, particularly high school youngsters who are academically oriented and thinking about college, are stressed out, that they're falling behind, that they may not be achieving at the level that they want to achieve. And of course, there's going to be a lot of variation from students who have been pursuing their studies at home, but others who maybe didn't do that so much. Students who did have internet access and access to online learning and others who did not. So we're going to see a lot of academic unevenness as well as these other problems. So, and of course, all of this would be plenty. Our plate would be full. But of course, we have a surge in concern over racial justice, over the police use of force. Very important, very understandable concern, overdue concern. But the timing of this is that it greatly complicates dealing with the pandemic, dealing with the academic strains that we're going to have with kids coming back to school. And certainly, depending on the region of the country, you may see protests, you may have seen riots. Here in Virginia, protests over Confederate statutes and Confederate flags, calls to reduce police funding and to revise the role of police officers in schools. So all of these are issues that may contribute to students becoming stressed out, engaging in threatening behavior that needs an assessment. So the kinds of threats that I think we might see First of all, threats of self-harm are always a concern. And when kids are more distressed, feeling more questioning about their life circumstances, there may be additional threats of self-harm. Now, threat assessment was not designed for suicide assessment, but many threat assessment teams have been assigned the responsibility to deal with threats to self as well as threats to others. And my one sentence recommendation here is that we need to use established evidence-based procedures for suicide assessment alongside threat assessment when threat assessment is indicated. We certainly see social media threats. Kids are spending a lot of time online, and kids need a lot of education and guidance about appropriate online behavior because they can impulsively make threats that might seem alarming and serious, but which they don't really intend. And so I think COVID-19 related threats are certainly a concern. Students will react to this kind of situation and make threats about contamination in a kind of unthinking, often impulsive way. And again, we're going to need to have education. We're going to have to develop social norms. Now, there's a question about school resource officers. What happens with officers if they're removed from the school? I think that's a serious and legitimate concern. I think schools need to look carefully at the pros and cons of law enforcement officers in their school. We're reviewing statewide data in Virginia, where we surveyed all students and staff about the SROs in our high schools. The vast majority of students and staff report that they feel safer with the SRO in the school. So we need to recognize that for those students, any change in the SRO involvement may create feelings of less safety. And of course, there are a lot of concerns about law enforcement not making people feel safe, and we need to address those concerns as well. So we have a really complicated situation, and it's going to take time in order to deal with it. We also have the election. Good gosh, all the political rhetoric, all the debate around an election, and you might think, well, that's for adults, that's not for kids, but actually studies we've conducted here in Virginia found that election rhetoric, election politics do influence the kind of teasing and harassment and banter we see in our schools. And here in Virginia during the last presidential election year, we saw a surge in race and sexuality related teasing and harassment in some school districts. So that certainly is an additional complicating factor. All this to say is that we need assessment. When a student makes a threat, the background, the circumstances may be complicated, and we need to take some time to understand that. So how are we going to make adjustments to our threat assessment process? Well, we need to keep in mind that the purpose of threat assessment is always to prevent violence, and to do this without overreacting to student misbehavior that's not serious or underreacting to student behavior that is more serious and cause for concern. So that's a challenging task, but we need to keep that framework in mind. Threat assessment is really a problem-solving approach. That is, when a student makes a threat, it's a big red flag that there's a problem. They have a concern, a challenge that they weren't able to deal with, and out of frustration or anger, they responded with a threatening statement or some kind of threatening behavior. And threat assessment teams, really they're threat assessment and intervention teams, because threat assessment is not just assessment, it includes intervention. We're going to try to solve the problem, figure out what the problem is, what the concern is, and then what are the appropriate steps that we can take to help young people resolve those problems. That's our orientation. Now, there's 3 phases to threat assessment. There is identification phase. And by that, I mean people have to report threats. They have to report their concerns. They have to notice when somebody is distressed and know that they can seek help for them. And so we need to have a school climate where people feel supported, where they understand the difference between snitching and seeking help. And then we have to have an evaluation phase. This is where our team comes in. When a threat has been reported by whatever mechanisms you have available to you, whether it's word of mouth or an anonymous reporting system or some other approach, when a threat is reported, the team has to be there to listen, to gather information, and to evaluate the seriousness of the threat. This is not a zero tolerance approach. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. This is an assessment. Our response is going to be calibrated based on the seriousness of the threat. And then based on that assessment, our third phase is intervention, when the team is going to initiate some kind of assistance, some kind of support services to address the underlying problem, conflict, or need. And in the most serious cases, where we think that there is a serious threat of someone being injured, we will take protective actions, which might involve supervision, and in the most serious cases, of course, would involve law enforcement investigation and appropriate action in a relatively small percentage of cases. So threat assessment should be conducted whenever someone observes a threat. A threat may be a statement, it may be a direct or indirect statement of intent to harm someone, or it may be some kind of concerning behavior that indicates planning or preparation to harm someone. Now, certainly there is no profile of a school shooter. We don't want to have a typology or list of characteristics, but we want to recognize that if we're concerned about someone, we'll err on the side of taking a look, doing an inquiry to see whether a threat is present. Now, this is not a new approach. You know, the FBI and Secret Service recommended threat assessment more than 20 years ago. Our own work began in 2001. I assisted the FBI in their study of school shootings in 1999. I went back to the university and I said, there ought to be some way we can adapt this and use this in our schools. And so we worked with a group of educators to adapt threat assessment principles from the FBI and Secret Service so that they would be useful and applicable to school. And so we talk about school threat assessment, and we talk about comprehensive school threat assessment guidelines. Let me just say, our guidelines take the approach that we don't want to overreact or underreact. Now, here's sort of the quintessential example of overreaction. A student who was suspended from school for chewing his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. Now, whatever you might think about that kind of behavior, from a threat assessment perspective, a Pop-Tart is not a dangerous weapon. The boy did not pose a serious threat to anyone. And you know, the only thing dangerous about a Pop-Tart is if you eat it. Well, let me say that, of course, we want to avoid the other error, the complementary error of underreaction. And we know that when a student brings a weapon to school or makes a serious threat of violence, we have to take appropriate action. And our threat assessment model is designed to help us recognize and respond with a more complete assessment and response to those kinds of cases. We have to recognize that threats lie on a continuum, that there are low-level threats that are not serious at all, that might be figures of speech or jokes or expressions of anger that are fleeting, rhetorical, but the person doesn't seriously intend to kill someone or seriously injure someone. We also have kind of a middle level of threats that are probably done to seek attention or maybe cause a disruption or maybe to frighten and intimidate someone. But the highest level of threats are the threats that truly are warnings of impending violence. And we do know that we've been able to identify such threats and prevent serious acts of violence, including school shootings. There are studies of school shootings that have been averted. And the key in most of those cases is that a student or young person came forward and reported the threat. It was investigated, found to be serious, and the school and law enforcement was able to intervene. So our threat assessment process is structured. Our educators told us they wanted a clear sequence to follow, and we have 5 steps in our threat assessment model, and these steps are designed to be efficient and practical and clear-cut. And many threats may turn out not to really be a threat at all, in which case the threat assessment process is handled at step 1. We don't want to do a comprehensive, thorough threat assessment process for every single case, every single time a student makes a statement that seems threatening. That's not efficient. In the school systems that have tried that, the system collapses under its own weight and threats get ignored. We must have an efficient process so that we can reserve our resources and concentrate our efforts on the most serious cases. So once we decide that the student's behavior or whatever was reported to us is a threat, we next try to resolve the threat as a transient threat, as a threat that is not serious. It might be expression of anger or a joke, and we have a process to resolve transient threats. And in fact, about 3/4 of the threats that come to attention of school authorities do get resolved as transient threats. On the other hand, if it's not a transient threat, it's called a substantive threat. It has substance. And here we're going to take protective action. And we've got a list of actions that we will take and who is going to take them in cases that are more substantive. Now, some substantive cases are serious. They might involve a fight or an assault of some type. And then a smaller number go beyond a fight, and they involve a really very serious case in which someone might be threatening to commit a shooting, a stabbing, or some other really dangerous act. And those are the cases, less than 10% of the cases, which we do a more comprehensive mental health assessment, we have law enforcement investigation, and we develop a safety plan. So all of this is explained in a lot more detail in our manual and in our training program, but this is just a brief overview of how we proceed. We have forms which are freely available to describe the threat assessment process. There are interviews that we conduct along the way, and questions and ways to formulate responses as part of this process. Let me just say we've done a lot of training and workshops. The threat assessment model that we developed is we've done training in 36 states. We have thousands of schools. The entire state of Florida is using our model, and we're very pleased with that. And we're also doing a lot of work to monitor the quality of the training and the quality of implementation. Let me just say that this is an evidence-based program. During this past 20 years, we have done a series of studies that we have submitted for peer review and have been published in referee journals as scientific evidence of the effectiveness of our threat assessment model. And I'm pleased to say ours is the first and now and still only threat assessment model that has been subject to controlled studies to demonstrate its effectiveness. Now, we've got 12 studies here. These are the citations. I would be happy to send you copies of any of these. Gee, maybe I'll just run through each of these one at a time and go through the stats and results. How about that? Well, no, I'm just joking. I know we don't have the time or energy for that. But let me just say we've done field tests, we've done controlled studies, and then we've done large-scale implementation studies to show how this works in practice. All right, let me just summarize a little bit of this research. I know you don't want to hear all the details, but across thousands of cases, thousands of threat assessment cases, 99% of threats are not carried out. The small percentage that have been carried out did involve an assault, but no serious injuries. Let me just say that our threat assessment does not involve an overreaction to student misbehavior. In fact, only about 1% of the students receiving a threat assessment were ultimately expelled from school. Only about 1% of the students receiving a threat assessment were arrested by law enforcement. So this is clearly not a zero tolerance approach. It's an approach that takes a graduated approach based on the seriousness of the case. And overall, we find that these students receive an increase in counseling services. And when we surveyed the school climate with student and teacher surveys, the teachers and students in our schools using our threat assessment model report feeling safer and report less bullying. Well, we're very concerned about the use of exclusionary discipline, suspension out of school, and expulsion, largely because of the research evidence showing that it's not a very effective disciplinary practice, that it generates racial disparities, and it contributes to the dropout rate and juvenile crime rate. So we have looked very carefully in a series of studies at the implications of using threat assessment, and we found that students receiving a threat assessment using our model have a lower suspension rate and do not have disparities between Black, Hispanic, and white students in whether they're suspended or receive some other disciplinary consequence or law enforcement action. We also know that schools using our model back off on their use of exclusionary discipline and see lower suspension rates and reductions in overall disparities in discipline. Certainly, the pandemic is going to require some adjustments in our threat assessment process. We're going to see a lot of social media threats. We're going to have to do some online interviewing. Now, there's research that school counselors and psychologists can do online interviewing and gather good information. It's probably not optimal. It's not comfortable for us, but it can be done. And teams can also operate online and communicate. It's not optimal. It's not the same as being together, but it is feasible. And there's research showing that in the school psych field that it can be done. And I think the online case management system, such as the System Navigate 360 is developing, will be a way to facilitate that. So the social media threats, let's keep in mind, most of them are going to be transient, not serious. We don't have good social norms around appropriate internet behavior. That's true for adults as much as it is for kids. And so we see a lot of statements made that are outrageous, inappropriate, and overstated. And we certainly need education. We need a certain amount of disciplinary response to those kinds of behaviors. But from a threat assessment perspective, most of them do not pose a serious threat of violence and can be handled within school discipline and school support services. We need to do a lot of proactive education so that students are reminded and taught that internet behavior is taken seriously, that you can't say whatever you want, that before you press submit or send, you need to stop and think because others might take what you've said differently than you intended, and that can lead to very serious consequences. As I mentioned, we can do online interviewing as part of the threat assessment process. And there are secure platforms to deal with some of the confidentiality issues. And there are developing professional standards for doing online telehealth and telecounseling services. And so our school psychologists and counselors and social workers, of course, are already, I think, receiving information on this from their professional organizations. And this needs to be incorporated into our threat assessment process. Now, of course, beyond the interview process, we need to have team meetings. We need to have records that are accessible to team members who are in different places. And so I think online case management, which is already a good idea in itself, is increasingly necessary in our new hybrid environment dealing with the pandemic. Let me turn to the third and final topic, and then we'll have some time for questions. I want to talk about how school leaders can respond to some of the news media claims that we're seeing that threat assessment is harmful or that it's unfair to students. Those of you who are using threat assessment programs may have already experienced some of this. Others, I think, can anticipate it because we're starting to see this literally from coast to coast, cases in which criticisms of threat assessment have arisen. And I want to say a little bit about how we can prepare for that. When I say coast to coast, here's a case in Oregon, another case in New Mexico. I'm going to show you in a minute a case in Philadelphia. Cases in which it seemed, according to the news report, that the school authorities had overreacted to student misbehavior. A student maybe had a threat or engaged in some kind of behavior that raised concern, and then the school responded with some disciplinary action or suspension, in some cases an arrest. And then there's criticism that the school is overreacting, and the school says, well, we did a threat assessment. Now, this really troubles folks in the threat assessment field because often it appears that what the school did was not threat assessment, but some kind of zero tolerance approach that's inconsistent with threat assessment. And of course, even if there are cases where threat assessment is done wrongly or inappropriately, this doesn't mean that threat assessment is not valuable, that it cannot be used successfully, as we've found in the vast majority of cases. But again, I think we need to be very conscientious about our use of threat assessment, use it with good fidelity, evaluate our use of it, and make sure that we are not making mistakes in our process. Here's a case that came to my attention a couple of months ago. This was in the news media. A 6-year-old girl with Down syndrome was frustrated in class, and she pointed her finger like a gun and said, "I shoot you," to the teacher. Now, the teacher did not feel in distress or in danger, but the teacher followed the school process, reported the student's behavior as a threat. The school principal then summoned the threat assessment team, and in fact, the threat assessment team said this is a transient threat. This girl was briefly upset. She doesn't pose an ongoing risk of violence, and so forth. And so, this seems to me like an appropriate use to avoid overreaction to student behavior. But here's the catch. The school board had added some additional requirements to the threat assessment process. The school board took a zero tolerance approach and said every threat must be reported to law enforcement. Every threat, no matter the circumstances. Now that's antithetical to the threat assessment process, which says all threats need to be evaluated. And that's certainly a concern. Now, in this case, when the police were notified, no, thankfully, they did not arrest the little girl. They did not do anything other than say, thank you for this information. The police were understandably not interested in this case as a potential serious threat. But in fact, just contacting the police was alarming to the parents. And there were other parents who said, they contacted the police about my child, and my child's threat was not serious either. And so you can imagine that this snowballed, and pretty soon there was a great deal of concern, as well as media attention, as well as attention by civil rights groups. And the school board needed to reformulate its directives to the schools on how they should handle threat assessment cases. So this is kind of, I think, just a cautionary example of how we need to be careful about how we implement threat assessment and always use good judgment rather than rely on a fixed rule without any possibility of exceptions or flexibility. I know sometimes we want to have fixed rules so that we don't make a misjudgment, but common sense always has to prevail in something as complicated as a threat assessment. So I have to say we're seeing some very strong reactions to threat assessment, fears and concerns that young people, particularly minority youth, will be mistreated by the threat assessment process. We certainly have a problem of huge racial disparities in school discipline, and and that is a concern. But threat assessment actually I see as a way to reduce those disparities and to avoid those overreactions. And so I think we need to understand that threat assessment is actually designed to address some of the problems that it's being associated with. And again, our research evidence shows across hundreds of schools that we are able to do that. Now you're probably getting a little tired and you've heard enough from me, and I'm just about to spring some data on you, some statistics on you. So buckle up, hold on, but I do want to show you a little bit of our data because I think we have to respond with facts. Now, when we do threat assessments, we have to understand that we do share information. We have a whole section in our training on the use of FERPA, on the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act, which does allow us to share information in serious cases. And there's a whole lot of issues there around FERPA that I think need to be cleared up. But the bottom line is that FERPA does not prevent us from doing threat assessments and does not prevent us from notifying people that we're concerned about as in danger in the most serious cases. Lots more I can say about that a little bit later, and maybe we'll do a Q&A on that or an FAQ on that after. But let me just say, here's some quick data from 339 schools using our threat assessment model. And let me point out that 3/4 of these cases, 77%, were resolved as transient threats, which were not serious, and a small percentage were substantive cases that did have concern that rose to the level of protective action and developing a safety plan for that student. In terms of the breakdown across grade levels, we see threats at every grade level from pre-K through 12th grade. Now the blue bars are the threats that were judged to be transient, and the red bars are the smaller number of threats that were judged to be substantive. And that number at the top is the total of the two bars. So if you want to figure out what the size of the red bar is, subtract the top number or the bottom number from the top number. So for example, in kindergarten, we had 26 threats, only 2 of which were judged to be a substantive threat. I'm sure those probably involved a fight where they really felt they needed to separate the kids and calm them down and counsel them. And the other 24 were very quickly resolved as transient threats. And so this is the distribution of threats. You can see in the middle grades, we've got more threats, and particularly in grades 7, 8, and 9, we have a slightly higher percentage of substantive threats. And these are our 7th, 8th, and 9th graders who get into fights. And when they threaten to fight one another, we certainly want to do a threat assessment, try to resolve the conflict or problem before it escalates. In terms of who is threatened, as you can see, 71% of the cases, students threatened other students. These are peer conflicts. 15% involved teacher threats, and you can see the breakdown of the rest. As I said, the threats are not carried out. In 97.5%, the threat was not even attempted. There was a small percentage of threats that were attempted but averted. As the threat assessment team was aware, school authorities were aware, and they were able to stop the threat from being carried out. And in less than 1% in this sample, a threat was actually carried out. Now, all of these threats that were carried out involved an assault, some type of fight. I can't be sure that there weren't fights that took place somewhere that school authorities didn't know, that one boy had threatened another and they had a fight after school somewhere. But I do know that the threats to kill and shoot one another, I'm reasonably confident, very confident, did not occur. We've had in this sample hundreds of threats to kill and shoot one another, and no shootings or certainly no killings. In terms of disciplinary outcomes, reprimand, suspension out of school. These are common reactions, although we try to minimize the use of out-of-school suspension. Some schools still feel wedded to that approach, despite evidence that it often is not effective. But you can see down there that in terms of arrest, expulsions, and juvenile detention, 1% or less of the cases. In terms of school placement, 86% of our kids had no change in school placement. They came back to their school. They continued their education where they were. We do have cases where it seems best to transfer the student to an alternative school, some cases involving homebound instruction, some transfers, and some other outcomes. All of this is written up. It's in our manual, and it's in some articles that I'd be happy to send you and give you more details. Now, in terms of disciplinary outcomes across race, we're very concerned about this. And so we looked at, in this sample, students who were classified as white, black, or Hispanic. We had 453 white students, for example, 225 black, and 73 Hispanic students. And then the percentages of those students who received those disciplinary outcomes is shown in the chart. And as you can see, there were no statistically significant differences. Very small differences that could have been due to chance were not statistically significant between white, black, and Hispanic students. Now, I have to say, these lack of differences are pretty remarkable because in these same schools and across the United States, black students are suspended at 3 times the rate as white students, and Hispanic students in many schools are suspended at a higher rate than white students. But in the students who received a threat assessment, those disparities did not exist. Let me just say, I don't want to take credit for all of this work. I have a great research team. This is our current research team, but we've got others. And threat assessment is been a central focus of our research over the years. And let me also thank Navigate 360 for arranging this webinar. I really want to recognize them for the work that they're doing throughout the field of school safety, but particularly in working with me to develop a case management system that puts all of our forms in one place, facilitates teamwork, and a higher quality threat assessment process. So I'm sure you can get more information about that from Navigate 360. All right, I'm thinking, am I out of slides? Yes, this is my final slide. I just want to say that I think school threat assessment is a very promising and valuable practice. Nearly half of the schools, over half of the high schools in the United States now report that they're using some kind of threat assessment. And I think our next step is to make sure that they use high quality threat assessment, that they evaluate their threat assessment and make sure that their staff are trained and are using it to the best possible advantage. All right, now we've got a little bit of time for questions. I'll try to answer some questions, see what other comments people have. And Jason, if you've got any instructions for me, I'm happy to do that.
Dewey, I don't think Jason has any specific directions, but I've been monitoring and watching the chat as they've come in, and you touched on this, and maybe you can expand on it, but there was one particular question around what is your counsel around FERPA? If you could share just a bit more detail on FERPA and how to manage it.
Well, educators experience a condition that I call FERPA phobia. That is, they're very afraid of FERPA violations. But in fact, FERPA has released a lot of documentation that should ease the fears about FERPA. Certainly in a health or safety emergency, schools are not constrained by FERPA and can share information that is essential or relevant to safety. In other cases, keep in mind that you may gather information about a student's behavior, something you observe or hear, and that information is not automatically covered by FERPA. Personal observations by educators is not automatically a FERPA restricted piece of information. It's also possible, and again, the federal government has weighed in on this, for law enforcement officers who are appointed to serve on threat assessment teams can have access to school records that's relevant to a threat assessment. They cannot use that information for other purposes other than threat assessment purposes. It's also possible in many states, like Virginia, for law enforcement to share information with the threat assessment team. And we really want to find ways to share information to communicate. Our community partners and our educators need to work together in these most serious cases. So there's a lot more to be said about FERPA. Hopefully that will help for now.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Dewey, let me ask you another question that came up, and it's more of a comment that's in the chat room, where Pennsylvania requires that the number of threat assessments that are conducted be reported to the school board. And I think the question here is, because a fight or a threat to fight is considered somewhat substantive, there's a concern around the conclusions that ultimately get drawn.
Yeah.
And applicability are lumped into the seriousness or severeness of a threat. What would you say about that, and what advice would you give?
Well, we've got to educate our school boards. We've got to educate our teachers, parents, the community as a whole. There's a lot of fear and anxiety around threats. When you say threat, you automatically think about a school shooting, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of threat cases. And I think school boards should know about the work of threat assessment teams. They should know how many threat assessments were conducted. But more than that, they need information on the seriousness level of the threats, trends in the threats. And it's, again, as you know, with a good case management system, one of the things you want to be able to do is look at how many threat assessment cases you had across grades, across schools. You want to look at how serious they were, what actions were taken. I'm working with a couple of school systems right now who are looking at the graduation rate and the dropout rate of students who had received the threat assessment. And what we're finding is that in the vast majority of cases, the threat assessment led to additional services, additional support for students, and they in fact were able to continue to school and to graduate. I know there's a lot of anxiety about school shootings, but we can't let fear drive our policies and practices. And we need to educate our school board about what we mean by threat assessment. And that term threat, I know, is a little ominous, but in fact, students make threats all the time. In fact, most threats to kill, we found, come from elementary school. And of course, they're largely not serious threats, but we have to sort of step back from that word threat and really look at the data.
Yeah, thank you. I'll expand on that or ask another question that I think is just part of an answer. I know working with you, communication and education here is important. We're trying to educate society. We're trying to educate our boards about the threat assessment process and the intervention. And I know the work we do with you is all about, how do we really take kids and reach them early on in their points of despair or need for help and get them back on a healthy path. Yeah. But as you see it, communication being one and education another, what are other challenges that threat assessment teams must overcome?
Well, we don't have enough school counselors, psychologists, and social workers in our schools. As many studies have shown, we're understaffed, and we're heading into a period where student problems and concerns are increasing. So I think we need to go to our school boards, and our school boards need to go to local governments and say, look, we've got a tremendous need here. we've got to have enough staff to have the time to deal with these problems. And certainly waiting for a crisis and recovering from a trauma is far more expensive, far more consuming than preventing things. Now you mentioned, threat assessments for something that's as minor as a fight or an argument, and I would say, hey, that time is well spent. If we can teach kids how to resolve a fight or an argument before it escalates to violence, we're going to have dividends from that long down the road. And so let's think about intervening early and investing in our student support services, our student support staff.
Terrific. And I'll close with just one question, because you just touched on there's a greater need around prevention and a need for resources and trained professionals and staff in our schools. At the same time, you alluded to this early on, that the risks that might be presented when SROs leave the school. And there was a question about that, like what additional risks do you see about with respect to SROs not being in the schools?
Yeah, I am concerned about it. Certainly there are cases where there's been problems with SROs and they need to be addressed. Usually I think they're personnel issues rather than systemic issues. I think schools need MOUs that clarify the role of SROs. The National Association of School Resource Officers is very clear that school resource officers are not there to enforce discipline. They're not there to criminalize student misbehavior. They're there to be resources, educators, sources of safety and security when that's needed. And yes, we are looking at the use of school resource officers in our schools statewide. We are preparing some research briefs, some summaries. I will make them available to all the attendees here because before all this arose, we've been each year asking students and teachers statewide, how much interaction do you have with your SRO? Have they contributed to making you feel safer at school? Have they made a positive contribution to school climate? And so we have staff opinions on this. I know there's a lot of good reason to be concerned about excessive use of force in law enforcement and about student behavior being criminalized. This is a big concern of ours. If we take the SROs out of school, though, I'm not sure that's going to help that problem. Because, in fact, I want law enforcement on the threat assessment team so that we have a shared perspective, so that we don't overreact to student misbehavior. Where I think we have problems is sometimes when you have a law enforcement officer who doesn't have threat assessment training, who's not familiar with schools, who's called in off the street because of a particular incident. When that officer comes in off the street, they're going to use the training that they've had for dealing with problems and concerns in the street. And they may not have the training and orientation to work in schools. So I really want law enforcement working in partnership with education, with a shared perspective, rather than having something else happen that's a little bit less under control.
Great. And let's just before I turn it back over, let me just ask you to kind of just describe, the type of training and education you do as part of your work. There was someone that asked, and I'm sure many others. They're at various stages. Some have already developed their threat assessment process and platform. Some that are using the Virginia model. Others that are already implementing but want training on what things are threats and how should you look for warning signs. So could you just talk a little bit about how you make yourself available and share?
Yeah. So I have a team that I work with that does training all across the country. We do a one-day workshop to get schools ready to go. It's turnkey training. We have a 150-page manual that describes our threat assessment process in detail. That's available. So those are to get people going, to get them started. We've also and we've had our hands full doing that, hundreds of workshops in the last couple of years. But we're also doing training. We're developing training online with Navigate 360 so that we can reach out to folks during the pandemic crisis. Look for more information from us in the next couple of months on that, and we'll have this training available certainly by fall for people to do it online. We're also responsive to the need for advanced training or ongoing training, and so we're developing training along those lines as well. And let me say, we also are developing, we also have a train-the-trainer program. That is, many school systems want to have their own trainers because they need to do training each year with staff turnover, and they need an experienced group who can serve as sort of coaches or mentors for the teams in their various schools. We've done a lot of train-the-trainer programs. We have about 300 local trainers. The state of Florida, we have local trainers in every school district in Florida so that they can continuously train, mentor, and supervise their schools. And so we realize it's not just a one-stop, one-shot process, but training and management really is an ongoing process in threat assessment.
Terrific. Well, Dr. Cornell, let me say thank you. Thank you for your time today, and even more so, thank you for your years of dedication and research and experience in developing the model and continuing the pursuit of education and reducing student violence. It's a privilege to work with you, and thank you for your time. Jason, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks very much to both of you. Great discussion here. A lot of great questions from the audience, and Dr. Cornell and Navigate 360 will work to respond to many of the fantastic questions that they were not able to get to over the course of our hour here. So everyone, that concludes today's webinar. A reminder that everyone will receive a link to the slides and the recording. And on behalf of District Administration, the leader in editorial coverage of news, trends, and current issues in K-12 management, have a great day and take care. Thanks again.
Bye. Bye.